Welcome back to Unlapped. We're just days away from the Canadian Grand Prix. We've had 3 different race winners over the last 3 race weekends, so we're obviously excited to see what goes down in Montreal. But first, we have some breaking news here on Unlapped. Katie George, Nate Saunders, Laurence Edmondson. Let's get right to it, gentlemen, shall we? Checo Perez has signed an extension with Red Bull through 2026. Laz, I'll start with you. Right call by Red Bull?
Well, Red Bull had a lot of options. It felt like going into here. They're clearly the top team under this current regulation set. Whether that will continue into 2026 is a big question that's wide open, which is also why we have all this speculation around Max Verstappen. But what they've done is they've gone for a bit of stability there. Of course, they want to keep Max. That's their number one priority, and he is contracted through to 2028. And by keeping Checo there, I think they'll keep Max happy. Max likes the idea of being teammates with Checo. So far, there's been a few little fireworks along the way, but it's been pretty one-sided. So Max will know that as long as he's at that team and that team is competitive, he's the one that's going to be leading it. So I think there's a little bit of that. I guess they know what they're getting with Checo. It's not always great, but it is fairly consistent. If you bring someone else into the mix, there's a number of really good drivers out on the market. Carlos Sainz, Esteban Ocon, we'll talk about him in a bit, but there's a few drivers which you could bring in, but would you destabilize the team? And I think that was something they really didn't want, considering how unstable that team has been so far this year. So I can kind of understand the logic behind it. But what's interesting is that if you look at the championship this year, we went into this year thinking, well, Red Bull have such a big car advantage. There's no way they're not going to win both championships at a canter. Do we even need to tune in for 24 races a year? And now you look at the Constructors' Championship, and I think the gap is 24 points. And the reason for that is because Ferrari have 2 exceptional drivers in Charles Leclerc and Carlos Sainz, both haven't scored a win, kind of against the odds, I suppose, to some extent this year. And Red Bull, where if you look at where they're dropping points is with Checo. Also, that this comes after 2 pretty disappointing results for Checo as well, is interesting. But that also goes to show that these decisions aren't based on, what happened at the last race or even what's happened at the last 3 races. They're long-term decisions based on a number of factors. And I think a big one of these is just that stability going forward.
Are you guys surprised, Nate, that it was 2 years as compared to maybe a 1-1 situation?
Yeah, that's what stood out in the announcement. And usually teams can be quite clever with that. When it is a 1+1 or a 2+1, you get the language of kind of multi-year deal or has or just sometimes it's just will stay with the team beyond 2024. It can be that vague. So I was surprised by that, and I was actually told in Monaco by somebody who's pretty well connected with the team that it was a 1+1 deal. And it's kind of been a sticking point, I think, for Perez. He's wanted that stability for obvious reasons. You have a 1+1 deal. It's effectively a 1-year contract because that 1-year extension is on the side of the team. And you have to basically prove to them again, you're worth that second season. And that's just not a good situation to be in. A lot of drivers say when they're on that kind of deal, it's difficult to stay focused. I mean, that was a big thing for Bottas. If you remember in the Mercedes days with Lewis, he kept getting 1-year deals and he just was constantly basically in the same cycle of he'd sign a new deal, he'd have a few months where he wasn't asked about it. Then January the 1st came around and everyone was just asking about his contract again. So you can see how it becomes an issue for drivers. What is interesting, if it is 2 years, and I've checked in with Red Bull just to be like, hey, have you worded this or is this 2 years? And what they're saying is no, this is a 2-year contract. What's interesting with that is that from everything that all the conversations Laurence and I have had in the paddock, is we know Carlos Sainz wanted this seat above anything else for, again, obvious reasons, right? Keeps him at the front end of the grid. What Red Bull said was the sticking point there was he wanted a long-term contract with Red Bull. They weren't willing to give him that. They were like, well, here's a 1-year deal. Sainz said, no, I've signed plenty of those short deals in my past. I want something longer. We know that Williams has now emerged as, potential landing spot for him. And I think this deal will probably mean we know where Sainz is going to go sooner rather than later. So it's interesting they've gone for 2 years. And it does speak to the point that Laurence made about keeping Max Verstappen happy. You get a driver in who he likes working with, who I don't think really causes any headaches behind the scenes, really. And I'm not saying Carlos Sainz is renowned for being a bad teammate, far from it. But I think you put someone like Carlos Sainz in there, you're adding an unknown in. You're adding a guy, and you're adding a guy in Sainz who still believes he can be world champion. I think a guy who has really only just recently had his breakthrough in the last couple of seasons. Perez, with the greatest respect to Perez, I think that's kind of been beaten out of him a little bit, again, to use the Bottas example, like it was with him at Mercedes. So you have that kind of driver who knows, like, hey, this is a pretty cushy situation. I'm not going to win the championship, but I'm still going to be driving one of the best cars in Formula One. I think that you keep that guy in the team. Sainz could just be such a destabilizing presence at a time, as we know, when things behind the scenes at Red Bull have been far from calm for a while. So yeah, it did surprise me in the wording of it, but the more you look into it, and I think the Max factor, keeping him happy, if they looked at it and said, right, if we give Perez a 2-year deal, it potentially helps us keep Max down the line. We know that Max potentially, has kind of looked at the Mercedes option going forward. Then it makes a lot of sense on that side. But yeah, it's very interesting because it kind of locks down where they're at for a couple of seasons if other drivers become available. So not the duration I was expecting at all.
I find it interesting what you said about Carlos Sainz wanting a long-term deal, and maybe that was kind of the issue with Red Bull. Laz, are you, I guess, surprised, again, to use the same question, that Carlos Sainz wasn't willing to maybe hedge or change his expectations and accept a 1-year deal, that he, stuck to his guns and wanted something longer and then maybe missed out on opportunity to race for Red Bull?
No, I think Carlos was right to do that. And you've got to look after yourself. If you go in on a 1-year contract against Max Verstappen in 2025 in a car that is an evolution of the car that Max Verstappen will probably win a 3rd consecutive championship with this year, you're asking a huge amount of yourself to then prove yourself to be anything other than blown away and kind of resigned to the driver market rubbish dump, to use a British word. But yeah, I feel like Carlos had to look for a long-term deal because 1 year against Max is really, really tough. It's a bit different for Checo because he's already been there, and it's a long thing. I wouldn't have been that surprised if Checo had signed a 1-year deal. Obviously, it's way better for him to have this 2-year deal in place, but I wouldn't be surprised if he had settled for a 1-year deal. But yeah, for Carlos, he has to look at this stage of his career at the age he's at right now. Okay, where am I gonna put myself so that I can move forward up the grid if necessary, or perhaps be part of a project that will move forward in the future. And of course, the big thing hanging over every driver's decision right now is the 2026 regulations. Who's going to have the best engine under those regulations? A lot of the signs in the paddock, although I don't think anyone knows absolutely for sure, is pointing towards Mercedes. And there's big doubts about Red Bull because they're building their engine by themselves for the first time. That's a huge undertaking. I'm not saying they're going to get it wrong. They've had a lot of good people. They've got an incredible new facility in Milton Keynes, but it's a huge amount to ask. So there's a question mark there. Whereas with a Mercedes engine, you're looking pretty solid. And then, of course, if you look at Ferrari, well, that's all sealed up with Lewis Hamilton and Charles Leclerc. If you look at McLaren as another Mercedes engine option, well, that's all sealed up with Norris and Oscar Piastri. So I think, yeah, Sainz was right to look long term and kind of keep his options open, but it's looking increasingly like he's been kind of funneled towards Williams, which is not something I would have said at the start of the year when Ferrari announced that Carlos would not be continuing with them because they had Lewis Hamilton coming in. I wouldn't have thought that Williams would be the option he ends up with. But when you start to look at it, and if that is maybe a 2-year with options deal going forward, then it could be a position where if Williams have a fairly competitive car in 2026, he can then use that to open up and play the market a bit when it's more obvious where everybody stacks up under the next set of regulations. So I think Carlos ultimately has had his hand moved a little bit. Like, I don't think this has been obviously hasn't been entirely his decision of where he got to go and where he wanted to be. I think he would have loved to stay at Ferrari if it had the possibility to do it. But with everything that's played out, it seems like Williams is the best possible option to him. The only thing that is interesting about that is what it means for the Audi Sauber project and how little confidence it seems quite a few drivers have in that project. Of course, we know Nico Hülkenberg's already signed up, but if you look at where he was in his career, I don't think he had any better options than that going forward. And, it will be a good position for him as a German driver, a German team, launching, this big brand going forward, potentially something he can latch himself to after his F1 career as well. But for the other drivers, the likes of Carlos Sainz, not to believe in that project, I think is interesting and significant going forward.
And isn't that so depressing? Like Audi coming in, big new, there should be a big wave of interest there. And Laurence is completely right. Every single conversation you have is people say, well, look, under the current rules as they are, it's going to be very difficult for Audi to come and hit the block straight away. They're basically building a team. They've got a team of people with a lot of experience, different types of experience in there, but they're bringing all these people together from scratch, and it's deflating in a way, because when they announced that Audi move, I thought, oh, what a kind of wild card option that could be for a few drivers. Maybe you back that from the beginning, but yeah, clearly Carlos not wanting to go there. It's just that fear of almost that McLaren Honda kind of. That's the only kind of comparison I can think of. When Honda came back with McLaren, they were so far behind. I'm not saying Audi will be that bad, but I think that some people are worried. Like, hey, these are guys coming in, competing with guys that have been doing this for a long time now, against each other. The pain that would have for your career is so damaging. I spoke to one agent in Monaco, and I was like, to their driver, who is not currently signed for 2025, and I said, what about Audi? Like, and they just looked at me and said, nah, like, we just don't see it. We're just not that impressed. And that's kind of been quite deflating, because I was hoping that would be a kind of, a bit of a spark in this driver market, but it's actually, because Laurence is completely right as well. I think when that Lewis news was announced at the end of January, if you'd put money on it, you'd have put money on Sainz to Audi Sauber. That almost seemed like a certainty at one point a few months ago, and it's just slowly kind of fizzled away. So that's been a quite interesting one to follow. But yeah, and now their options for Audi, because I mean, Hulkenberg's never had a podium. Hulkenberg, yeah, he's German, but I don't think he's really that big of a name to lead that team into the new era. You're kind of limited on options. So that's an interesting situation in itself.
Well, there is a race winner looking for a new home, thanks to the announcement that came from Alpine this week. They announced that Esteban Ocon will no longer be returning to Alpine at the end of the 2024 season. This decision brings an end to a 5-year relationship, which I think has often had some issues and difficulties. Although it's been, I think, rocky for Esteban and Alpine. They do have a long history together. He delivered Alpine's only F1 win in 2021. We talked about the incident in Monaco last week. There was rumors that you guys obviously put down that no way, shape, or form would Alpine bench him from the lineup in Montreal, because why would you do that to a driver? But there was questions of, okay, if they don't do that, what are the consequences going to be for Esteban Ocon? Would they part ways? Well, now we know the answer to that. So Esteban Ocon needs a new seat. I would say that Sauber and Audi would be one of those potential landing spots for Esteban. But I guess based on our conversation a week ago, Laz, were you expecting a decision like this to come this week before Canada?
I think we were expecting this decision regardless. And I don't think you can look at the Monaco accident or incident and say that that triggered this. I think if anything, that Monaco incident was triggered by the fact this was already going to happen, and Esteban already knew he was on the way out. So he did something which any teammate in a position where all is good and wonderful at the team would not have done. So I think that was probably a sign already that that this deal was going to go this way, where Alpine were going to get rid of him. Usually when these announcements are made, even if everyone knows that that's the direction it's going, it's usually done once the team has something to announce. So once they've signed a driver for next year, they would announce, first of all, maybe Esteban's leaving, and then the announcement. So we may get something fairly soon along those lines, or the other case being that the driver has already signed a deal elsewhere. So you get the announcement that they're leaving, and then often within 5 minutes we get another email saying so and so has signed to drive where. We had that with Haas when Nico Hulkenberg announced that he was leaving there at the end of the year to go to the Sauber Audi project going forward. So it's probably not a surprise at all. I think that relationship had run its course. If you look at the people in charge when Esteban first went to that team, most of those people have gone now. So it's clear that team has evolved in a completely new way, a completely different way. And I think in Pierre Gasly, they have a driver which they're pretty confident they want to keep, and they're pretty confident they will keep going forward. And it was getting increasingly obvious that Esteban and Pierre in the same team wasn't a brilliant idea. And I actually think it's good for Esteban, while of course it leaves him in a slightly tricky position going forward. He doesn't have a drive for next year confirmed yet. I feel like he's a good enough driver that he will be able to get hold of something. I don't think it's going to be a dramatic jump up the grid. I think you're right in saying maybe the Sauber Audi project is somewhere he could go. Haas is perhaps another team he'll be knocking on the door of. So neither of those are obvious huge steps forward from Alpine. But then if you look at where Alpine was when he joined to where they are now and the regression they've made, he may see it as a team that's actually only going one way anyway, and it's better to get out now and join a team that's on the up. So I don't think it's at all surprising. I don't think it's reaction in any way to what happened in Monaco, but I think what happened in Monaco was an indication that all was not well with that relationship going forward, and it was kind of inevitable that at the end of this year, at the end of Esteban's contract, which I think was a 3-year contract he had signed originally, and when it went out in the 3rd year of it, that he would be leaving to go somewhere else. But I still think he's a remarkably good driver. I think he has something that a number of other drivers do not have. I think because of his background, the fact that he had to fight so hard to come up through karting. You know, his family sold their family home, were living out of a caravan, and the results of his karting races determined essentially the future of both, of course, his racing future, but also the future of his family and what was going to happen. So he has this real kind of grit and determination that some other drivers don't have, I think. But it's clear that sometimes that works for him and sometimes it perhaps works against him, because that can also turn into a certain aggression on track. And when he's fighting against his teammate, and you know, this is not an isolated incident. What happened with Gasly at the last race, there are a number of examples of him fighting against teammates and trying to prove just how good he is. And I think at times that can be a negative. Now, if he was exceptionally talented, like Max Verstappen level or Lewis Hamilton level, and I don't think he is there. I don't think he's like a million miles off, but if he was that good, then that would be acceptable to some extent,
manageable.
And you know, it would just be part of the package. But I think he has to be a little bit careful with that, and wherever he goes next, he needs to prove to them, probably this year in the races he has left with Alpine, but he needs to prove to them one way or another that he's not going to go in and disrupt a team. He's not going to go in and throw away points when a team desperately needs them. You know, he can be a team player. So I think he does have that in him as well, but there does seem to be just this extra edge to him, which sometimes is very beneficial. I think it's a big part of the reason why he's in Formula One in the first place, but it can also work against him.
I think it's a shame because on paper, you would have thought that this would have been like a home run for Alpine with 2 French drivers. But I think when they made the decision, obviously, to bring Pierre Gasly to the team, all of us were scratching our head, because I think sometimes women, they want to be the person that's able to change the man from his bad ways. Like, I'm going to be the one to be able to change him, right? And I feel like Alpine was like, we're going to be the team to change these 2 and get them to work together. And obviously that hasn't panned out exactly how they envisioned, I'm sure. So obviously we'll wait to see where Esteban Ocon goes. But I'm curious, Nate, what do you think's next for Alpine? Like, who do they go get to fill that seat to be a new teammate for Pierre Gasly moving forward?
Yeah, I think the Alpine one now comes into focus. And that's what's been interesting about the last few months. We really haven't talked about Alpine until very, very recently. The focus was on, as we've talked about, Sauber and the Williams situation maybe, but also the Perez situation. And the Alpine situation is a weird one, because those 2 guys are both out of contract at the end of the year. They're both got a race-winning driver there. So I think this is a really fascinating situation. Now, the name that keeps being kind of floated around in these conversations is Yuki Tsunoda. A guy who really wants to get free of the Red Bull program that he's on, because we know now that, and obviously this deal confirms what we already knew, that Tsunoda's route to the top is, at the very least, is delayed for another 2 years. But from everything we've heard, is almost as closed off as you can get. So I think he'd be a great option there. I think he's desperate to get out of that. And I think that even though Alpine aren't the most exciting team to join right now, joining a team, a factory team, as we call them, a team that make their own engines, there's a lot of upside to that. And I think that Tsunoda would be a great driver to bring in there. He's exciting, in a lot of form at the moment, very, very popular as well. So I think we'd tick a lot of boxes. But Alpine, you've got to wonder. There's a picture going around. I actually sent it into a group chat that we have with myself, Laurence, and a few other journalists. There's this picture from a few years ago of Ocon, Alonso, and a young Oscar Piastri when he was the reserve driver. In the space of a few years, Alpine have gone from having arguably the most exciting group of talent, this exciting roster of a 2-time world champion, like Laurence said, Ocon, this guy that I think a lot of people do still rate in the paddock, and then Oscar Piastri. Every single one of them has gone. So they do have Jack Doohan, on their books at the moment, and Mick Schumacher, is still loosely attached with the WEC program. So you wonder whether the minds at Alpine are like, look, we've let some really good young talent get out of our hands in the past. Do they go that way? Do they they look at the example of Ferrari backing Behrman and Haas probably going that way as well next season and say, let's give a guy like Doohan a rookie seat if they can get a good driver in the other car as well, whether that be Gasly, whether that be Tsunoda. I can't see them going into a situation where they leave one of those drivers hanging just because of what's happened in the past. And that's a hunch. I haven't heard anything about that. But that's like got to be the most stinging lesson for Alpine for the last few seasons, of the fact that all those guys have gone. So I think Alpine's in a really interesting situation now. And I think it's quite an interesting test of the management. Obviously, it all changed again last season. Bruno Firmin has stepped up into that top role. I actually think some of the most difficult decisions to get right can be your drivers and making sure that your long-term decisions are in line with the team, because a few of us talk about this quite a lot. The 3-year deal that Ocon got kind of is what screwed that whole driver program up, because it then put Alpine into a situation where they had to pick between Alonso and Piastri. And I totally get why they backed Ocon in that situation. They just didn't have a clear plan with what they wanted to do with the other seat. And I think that if you're Alpine right now, you have to sit down and be like, let's write down what we want the future to be. Is Doohan the future of the team? Is Tsunoda going to be the future of the team? Is Gasly the future of the team? And if he is, they've got to put their foot down and say, we need to back these guys, because, a few of these guys now have just gone missing for them. But I think they're in a decent position. There's still a good amount of talent that they could probably go for, Tsunoda being the obvious option. And I think keeping Gasly, you would think most fans would find it surprising if you didn't try and keep him. But yeah, I think the other thing that I've noticed with Ocon and Gasly is that whenever you've asked them this year about staying with Alpine, they've never given you a committed answer to it. And I think that speaks to where the team is at right now as well. So if you're Gasly, all those seats that we've mentioned that Ocon could be in the frame for, I think add Gasly's name to it, because he's going to be looking now and saying, well, why can't I drive there too? It's almost like get me out of this situation. I'll try my luck somewhere else. So yeah, I think that's going to be one to follow, and it's actually quite difficult to predict. But if I had to make a decision heart over head, I would say for me, Tsunoda getting out of RB and either going to the Audi situation or to Alpine. Not sure they're the best options long term, but there's got to be better than where he's at right now, driving around for the Red Bull B team. So for me, that would be where I'd want them to go.
Laz, if you were Bruno, who's your first choice to go after of a guy who doesn't have a contract or seat for next season to fill Ocon's?
Yeah, I mean, I think Nate's right in that keeping Gasly is probably the priority, just to make sure that that's absolutely right. And it puts Gasly in a good position, because while, there are other options out there, he can now probably have some fairly robust negotiations with Alpine and get the kind of deal he wants, and a long-term one, and also kind of get some, he'll be looking for some reassurance from that team that they have made the right investments going forward. There's been a few questions about that, and and whether everything is up to scratch for that team to go and fight for wins and championships, because clearly the trajectory has been going the other way. But yeah, who do you feel? I actually agree with Nate. I think Tsunoda is a great shout. I'd be very upset if Tsunoda doesn't find a place on the grid for next year. I don't think that's going to happen, but yeah, I don't want to see him get left out. And I think that would kind of work for both sides going forward. Jack Doohan, I think, has got potential, but my concern there is that you would then, I mean, not really a concern, but just as a kind of observation, you would then have 4 rookies coming onto grid, 4 likely rookies, along with Behrman, Antonelli, Liam Lawson, not technically a rookie, but coming in for his first full season, and Doohan, and then that means you've got to get rid of the current 4 for all the current drivers on the grid, and I think Sargent going is probably very, very likely anyway. Zhou Guanyu going is very likely. Kevin Magnussen going is very likely, but then you start to run up against drivers where you're like, do these drivers really deserve to lose a place in F1? And I think guys like Bottas, Tsunoda, Ocon, obviously, Gasly, these are guys that really haven't yet shown their full potential in Formula One. and I'd be very upset if they didn't get the opportunity to do that. So it'll be fascinating to see how it all pans out, because you can get all the names and you get all the teams together and you start moving them around, and almost every combination of the available drivers left and the available seats left makes a certain amount of sense. So it will really come down to, I think, lengths of contract, how long teams and drivers are able to commit to each other. Obviously, drivers usually like a bit of stability, but also if they see themselves as being able to move forward, take advantage of seats coming up in the future, they like to have a little bit of flexibility built in there. And then, of course, the big thing that makes most of Formula One turn around, money, and who can offer the right amount of money, who's willing to take perhaps a cut price deal to make sure they're on the grid, and who can bring money to a team. Not such a factor as it used to be several years ago, but I wouldn't rule it out entirely that if a driver can bring a package of being a very capable on-track talent along with a sponsor or whatever, that could actually turn a team's head. So yeah, it'll be really interesting to see how it pans out and why it pans out. But I think we'll find out in the next few weeks. Now we've got these pieces falling into place. The Perez piece is huge. Ocon leaving Alpine, perhaps expected. But yeah, Perez as that confirmed seat at Red Bull. Then you think, well, Sainz is going to make his call now. Once Sainz makes his call, then the other teams and drivers will start to know who's going to go where.
Yeah, dominance.
And I think as well, what's been clear from talking to people is that the cost cap kind of idea of all these teams coming together, you are kind of starting to see that in the fact that guys like Ocon and Gasly have just kind of gone straight down to Haas and said, hey, do you guys have a seat available? A few years ago, I think that would have been like, okay, that's my career pretty much done, going to a team like that. And it's obviously, it's not the greatest place to be going, but I think there is this kind of understanding with a lot of drivers that hey, the playing field is much closer now than it was. And the difference between Q2 and Q3 could just be down to the driver, when it is that close. So I'm kind of I think that's becoming quite obvious in this driver market, which I'm enjoying as well. So because a friend of mine messaged me and was like, Ocon to Haas, what the hell? But I kind of explained that's not the worst move if they do make a step forward. And really the only way for a lot of the teams at the moment is up. Look at Haas and Williams are good examples of that. They're building towards something. So yeah, I think there's good reason to kind of roll the dice a little bit and go for one of those quote unquote smaller teams at the moment.
All right, well, let's hit our Canadian Grand Prix preview. Let's start at the top with Red Bull. Just going to say they're looking somewhat mortal, not as dominant of a team that we've seen from the last two seasons, which, for better or worse, I think fans are enjoying. The fact is they scored 8 points in Monaco, which was the lowest scoring total for the team since Bahrain in 2022 when they had a double DNF. So pretty interesting there. I think the RB20, it's fair to say, really struggled with the curbs and uneven surfaces of the Monaco streets. Laz, the circuit in Canada is also a street circuit, could provide maybe some similar issues for Red Bull. Is that fair to say?
I think it is fair to say there are some similar challenges and also some similar things which play to the strengths of Red Bull's rivals. And while it's easy to say, well, Red Bull is slipping up here and there, and it's clear that their car does struggle over bumps and curbs. They have to lift the ride height. They lose performance. That is all very true, but it's also true that the Ferrari is very capable at riding curbs. And if you look at some of the lines that the Ferrari drivers were able to take over the curbs at Monaco compared to what the Red Bull drivers were able to do, there's a big difference. And so that's still a factor in Montreal. Montreal has just been resurfaced. I'm pretty sure it's the entire track. I'm not there yet, but Perez was saying in their preview that the track surface has been redone. That could take out some of the bumps and some of the things that Red Bull maybe would have worried about with where they were in Monaco, transferring over to Canada. But we'll have to just wait and see how that pans out. The other thing about Canada, which is a weird similarity to Monaco, because you look at the two circuits and they look very different, because one has incredibly long straights, the other one, which is Montreal, and the other one, Monaco, has basically no straights to speak of. But they have a similarity in that all the corners are pretty much low speed corners. So it's one type of corner across the board. And one of the difficulties with these cars since 2022 and the ground effect cars is that you can get a car that handles very well in a low speed corner, but then it will be very twitchy and difficult to predict in a high speed corner. Or you can get a car that is really planted in high speed corners, giving the driver loads of confidence. But when you get to the in the high speed corners, and then when you get to the low speed corners, they struggle to get it turned in. So having that kind of consistency in corner type, I think actually plays to Red Bull's rivals a little bit. It plays to everyone in just nailing a specific setup. And if you can get that right, and you're not having to worry about curbs and stuff like that, then you can end up with a very fast race car. And I kind of feel like that's what happened with Ferrari, and almost the opposite happened with Red Bull. But I think, once we get away from these very specific, slightly strange street style circuits, and back onto a normal racetrack, Barcelona being the next one, then you'll see the Red Bull flying again. But I think this is another opportunity for the likes of Ferrari and McLaren to really try and beat Red Bull and take more points off them. Probably harder for McLaren, not traditionally a circuit layout that would suit the McLaren. But I think they've been surprised a little bit by what their car can do, and its pace at circuits where they didn't expect it to be particularly fast this year. So I would say both those teams will be looking at the Red Bull this weekend again and thinking, right, first of all, how do we qualify ahead? And then how do we beat them in the race? Of course, the only difference here is that compared to Monaco, is that overtaking is very possible at Montreal. Yeah. So if you do qualify ahead, you've got to make sure you've got the race pace to keep the Red Bull behind.
To that point, Max Verstappen leads Charles Leclerc in the World Drivers' Championship by 31 points. He's still more than a race win away for Charles Leclerc. But to Laz's points about the Ferrari, do you feel like they could possibly be the quickest car in Canada, Nate?
Yeah, I do. I do, for those exact reasons. And that's great to hear, isn't it? I mean, I know 31 points sounds like a lot, but given where we were last year and for most of 22,
we'll take it.
We'll take that. And what's actually the more interesting one, I don't have the points gap to hand, but is the Constructors' Championship. That is a lot closer.
Points.
24 points. So that's actually the one that I think the Drivers' Championship, like, I tend to agree that when we get away from Canada, basically, like let's not forget, like, Max had a bad weekend in Imola and he was on pole and then he won by 0.7 seconds. Like, so he's still been pretty, like, unstoppable out in front and is just unbelievable at the moment in terms of what he's able to do with the car. But that whole dynamic with the two Ferraris and, Red Bull really having one great driver and one driver that's a question mark is really fascinating. So yeah, if especially if Ferrari can take a big chunk of points out of Red Bull in this race, who knows how the rest of the season plays out? But that would be, I think that would inject some real excitement into things, because I can't remember the last time we've genuinely felt like Red Bull could be beaten to a championship. I guess 21 is the last time, or the start of 22, when it looked like it was going to be Ferrari and Red Bull all the way, and then Ferrari fell away. So that would be great. And I'm pretty excited to see the kind of form that Sainz is in this weekend, because obviously we saw Charles win in Monaco. We've now had this Perez news, which I think he's known for a while is coming. But I think that Carlos Sainz really performs at his best when he's really fired up, when he's got a point to prove. And I think this weekend will be a proper one of those. So yeah, I'm excited for a lot of different reasons. And also, I just saw a clip of it the other day. I forgot how good the Vettel-Hamilton moment was here a few years ago. Was that 2019 with the whole Bollard switching over? So I watched about must have been about 50% of that race again on YouTube yesterday. And it just reminded me how much I love the Montreal circuit. Such a good track, and it feels like there's always drama just around the corner there. So yeah, I can't wait if Ferrari are the best team, especially.
What also sometimes lends itself to rain and weather playing a factor, and that's a potential for this weekend, not just in the race, but maybe in qualifying. Was it last year where Alex Albon was superhuman in qualifying when the downpour came and he gambled? Was that last year or 2 years ago? Remember, he made it into Q3 by staying on the softs in the rain, I believe. Maybe I'm mixing up the tire.
Yeah, no, you're right. I just can't remember exactly which. Yeah. Nate, you were there. You should know.
Yeah.
Full of pressure on you.
I remember it raining a lot last year, so I think that's right. So I remember getting absolutely drenched when I was there.
No, this is when you forgot your raincoat, right?
Yeah, last year. Yeah, and I was.
Yeah, so this was last year.
Through. So I sat on my seat in the media center, and I stood up, and the seat was like soaking wet. I've never seen, like, people were looking at me like I was deranged. But yeah, that was a great example of that. And yeah, man,
Nate, what was the other thing that happened? What was the other thing that happened last year to you in Canada? Seems to remember that was another funny story.
Was with the car?
It was with the car.
Yeah. We'll tell the story quickly because it is funny. So the Montreal circuit, you have to drive down this long kind of river that runs parallel to the circuit, which used to be the Olympic rowing circuit. Mm-hmm. So it's a bit of a pain actually, because you drive all the way down and you drive past the entrance to the circuit, and you drive about half a mile down and you have to walk back. I mean, proper first world problems. And I was giving a few people a lift back at the end of one of the days. May even have been the day I forgot my raincoat because I was just having an absolute mare of a day. Get back to the car, and the other journalists were like, "Is your car on? Is your car running?" And I was like, playing it off like I don't think it is. But I think I just left the engine idling all day, and I'd been at the circuit for about 11 hours. But I mean, it must have been going on and off because like the fuel tank hadn't gone down much. Like I don't in that situation, I would have assumed like half. Maybe, I mean, maybe not. Who knows? But yeah,
Is the battery dead?
No, that's the other thing. The battery wasn't dead, so it must have been like idling and like keeping itself recharged. But yeah, whenever I think of Canada now, I do think of that story. And the amazing thing with this is when I'm not a racist, these stories immediately make it back to lads from different people. So
I'm sure
it's got a lot of spies in the media center.
what that reminds me of is when you're at the airport and you get on like the walking escalator and they're so long and then you realize you've passed your gate. So you're just passing your gate and then you have to continue to ride it and then I have to walk your
And then you
back.
see that about 3 other people have done the same thing as you. And you're like, okay, I'm not alone.
Exactly. Couple other storylines for the weekend. Lance Stroll is said to have a strong car for his home Grand Prix. After Monaco, Fernando Alonso admitted to being a little worried with Aston Martin's progress this year. Laz, did you think that those were fair comments from Fernando?
I think so, yeah. I mean, if you look at where when we talk about Aston Martin, where they were at the start of the 2023 season as the clear second best team, and it was all of a sudden this belief, wow, this is a team that's on the up. They've got this new factory coming online, the new wind tunnel, which is about to come online now. And everyone's thinking, could they be this new super team going forward? And while they've actually maintained a level of performance that's pretty good, I think, they managed to actually stay fairly steady. The likes of McLaren and Ferrari have moved ahead of them. I would say now that they're behind Mercedes as well, and Mercedes are quite confident about some upgrades coming the next few races. So, that's not going to be a still target for them going forward. Meanwhile, RB, I think, genuinely starting to look like a regular competitor for top 10 positions, certainly with Yuki Tsunoda, occasionally with Daniel Ricciardo as well. And you start to think, well, wait a minute, what's happening with Aston Martin here? Right? Are they starting to fall back? They brought some upgrades to the car at recent races that didn't seem to have the effect that they wanted. I don't know whether that's entirely fair because they'll have data that will say exactly what happened, but the noises from Alonso weren't particularly positive. And then in terms of relative lap time versus the Ferraris, the McLarens, and the Mercedes, they didn't seem to, they seem to drop back rather than move forward, which is obviously never good. But when you brought a fairly substantial upgrade, which actually changed a huge amount of the aerodynamic surfaces of the car, so I think there is reason to be concerned. But the gaps are so small at the front at the moment that I think someone like Fernando Alonso is capable of putting that car maybe 4 positions higher than it should be on the grid, and then potentially see that through in the race. But all of a sudden, I think they're asking a huge amount of their drivers, especially Fernando, who has kind of carried that team through the last 2 years to make sure that they've got results which are probably a little bit better than the car's performance. And there comes a point where I think Fernando can no longer do that because they've dropped too far behind. So, I hope, just for the nature of a competitive field in Formula One, I hope that Aston Martin kind of are able to unlock a bit of performance from these upgrades that they've brought, get the car back into a happier place. But we did see something similar happen last year where they lost their way with development. It actually started in Canada and they never really kind of got back on track, and they lost that ground to McLaren, Ferrari, Mercedes. And so, I feel like they need something over the next few races just to convince Fernando and to convince everyone really at the team that, we are still making progress in the right direction. It's just going to take, the same amount of time that it takes for any Formula One team to get to the front. And the seeming miracle of the early 2023 part of the season, it was a little bit of a kind of red herring. It's not actually what happens in Formula One. It is a huge amount of hard work to get to the front. So yeah, we'll see where they end up. But I think there's good reason to be a little bit concerned from Fernando's perspective as to where that team's going right now.
And there's no Lance Stroll grandstand this year. Well, what's going on there? They usually have a Lance Stroll grandstand, hottest ticket in town. This year, not there. Don't know why that is.
Wow, is that as of this year, or was that?
Yeah.
So it was definitely there last year.
asked Lance, because Lance mentioned in his Monaco press session it wasn't there, and I asked him why, and he said they ran out of t-shirts to sell, and I thought, I'm not sure if that is the reason, but pretty funny when a home race drops the grandstand of their home driver. But read into that what you will.
Why would that affect the naming of a grandstand? Oh, we run out of t-shirts. We better change the name of the grandstand.
Yeah, we better not name the stand after our local hero. Yeah, that there was a leap of logic there for me as well. But anyway, I just thought I'd throw that in. You know, unrelated to anything else.
Of course you would. On that note, we're gonna hit predictions. Here's how the standings currently look. Nate is atop the standings with 10 points.
What a turnaround, by the way.
What a turnaround. We've really flipped the table, ladies and gentlemen.
I just wanted to throw that in there.
Nate's got 10 points. I've got 9 points. Laz, you are trailing with 7 points. Whoa, 7 points. So having said that, you get to pick and make your predictions first. Please reveal them 3rd to 1.
Okay. Yeah, so I keep getting this wrong every time that I say Max will win. He doesn't.
Since we flipped it from 3rd to 1st.
That's right.
You've lost it.
That's right. It's throwing me out of it. Okay, so here we go. In 3rd place, I'm gonna say Max Verstappen.
Ooh.
Actually, can I change that, or is it too late?
Locked in.
Locked in.
Oh,
Lock it in,
locked in. Wow. Okay.
Okay.
No, I don't make the rules. I'm just trying to.
No, that's right. No, because I'm like, okay, fair enough. In 2nd place, Carlos Sainz. And in 3rd place, Charles Leclerc. So I'm going big on Ferrari. I was just thinking, I was like, actually, I should have put Max in 3rd and Max in 2nd and Carlos in 3rd.
Okay.
But anyway, I'll stick with it. Max 3rd, Carlos 2nd, Charles 1st.
I'm going to take exactly what you were thinking about doing. I'm going to go with, hold on, I have to say
I bet that happens now.
I have to say it in proper order. Carlos Sainz is going to run P2 for a long, long time, defending and being the sacrificial lamb to Max Verstappen. But Max is going to get past him in the 11th hour, okay? But Charles Leclerc is going to win the race. So I go Charles Leclerc, Max Verstappen, Carlos Sainz in that order. And I'm really glad that you f***ed up and put Max 3rd because I didn't want you to take me.
My pleasure. That's what I'm here for.
Well, I'm gonna flip the script a little bit then, because I said earlier about Sainz. I can't say that about Sainz being fired up and then not having anywhere else but winning. So I'm going to say the reverse of you, Katie, that Charles is 3rd, Max is 2nd, Sainz is 1st.
Ooh.
Just to throw that, just using my lead, my comfortable lead.
I'm really curious to see who of us is right or if none of us get anything right, because this would be a very interesting dynamic to see how this plays out with the Ferraris and Max.
This also, I think it's 2 weeks in a row now where none of us have backed Max to win, which I think has got to be
just first in the last 3 years.
Groundbreaking territory for about a year and a half. I'm all for it. Long may it continue.
Honestly, when Laz was talking about Aston Martin, the wildest thing that I thought he said in that answer was the first and only time Mercedes was mentioned was like at the 45-minute mark of this podcast. Do you imagine? Like, we haven't talked about Mercedes in quite some time, it feels like.
Yeah, that's true. Mad.
Do what you will with that, Mercedes.
I think we mentioned Lewis once. I think Laurence mentioned
that was in conjunction with Ferrari.
Yeah, exactly.
Not anything to do with Mercedes.
Crazy times.
Yeah. Okay. Laz, you're going to Montreal soonish. Safe travels. You're already stateside. Have so much fun at the race. Don't forget your rain jacket just in case. And make sure you turn your car off in the car park. Okay. Nate, have a great weekend off. And we will see you guys next week to break down all things Canadian Grand Prix. Have a great weekend, everybody. Cheers.